To be buried while alive is beyond question the most horrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. That it has frequently, very frequently, so fallen will scarcely be denied by those who think. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where one ends and where the other begins? We know that there are diseases in which occur total cessations of all the apparent functions of vitality, and yet which these cessations are merely suspensions, properly so called. They are only temporary pauses in the incomprehensible mechanism. A certain period elapses, and some unseen mysterious principle again sets in motion the magic pinions and the wizard wheels. The silver cord was not forever loosed, nor the golden bowl irreparably broken. But where, meantime, was the soul? History is filled with examples of mass hysteria caused by fictional or imaginary events, like the famous panic caused by Orson Welles' radio show based on the War of the Worlds that led its listeners to believe in a sudden extraterrestrial invasion. One of the most interesting cases of irrational fears incited by popular culture started with Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Premature Burial, published in 1844. After it became popular, the public began to show an alarming fear of being buried alive. The fear around the subject wasn't entirely unfounded, but the rare cases took all of the attention in comparison to a real condition called catalepsy, which affects people undergoing schizophrenia treatment and causing muscular rigidity and unresponsiveness. A remarkable case involving this disease happened in 1842, when a cataleptic man died, according to his physicians. However, he didn't. All of the respective rituals surrounding death were performed on him, but when he later showed signs of life, he was sued for refusing to pay for his own unnecessary funeral. Edgar Allan Poe was fascinated by these cases of catalepsy and wrote about it in other short stories, like The Fall of the House of Usher and Berenice. Several other literary figures have been fascinated by this condition as well, especially the fact that there might be partial consciousness during the state or complete lucidity, so people can actually listen to their own funeral. There are few things more horrific than the idea of being locked inside your own corpse, perfectly aware but unable to communicate with others. It's no wonder that writers of the horror genre were interested in the internal monologues of a catatonic person, especially in the 19th century, when the field of medicine wasn't advanced enough to distinguish the stiffness of a cataleptic person from a dead body. Then, those who read or heard those stories had nightmares about being unable to scream and tell the people around them to stop throwing dirt on their coffin. Patients suffering from catalepsy were once frequently mistaken for dead and thus buried alive. The term "saved by the bell" is an idiom commonly used to describe people who escape difficult situations thanks to a last-minute solution. But the light-hearted phrase actually may have a true scary story behind it, related to a medical condition known as catalepsy. Catalepsy is a medical condition in which a patient endures an uncontrolled state of muscle rigidity and unresponsiveness. The condition is often linked to episodes of catatonia. Although the disease is widely understood now, in the past it caused sufferers to be mistakenly buried alive. After newspapers reported on these tragic endings, writers like Edgar Allan Poe built similar incidents in his own creepy stories. The frequency of catalepsy patients being mistaken for dead led to a string of quick fix solutions by doctors and gravekeepers, though many of these ideas created new horrors of their own. One well-intentioned yet morbid solution was the creation of waiting mortuaries. In these hospitals for the dead, the bodies of suddenly catatonic patients were kept under observation for a few days to make sure they were actually dead. Waiting mortuaries were well stocked with food and wine and cigars in the event that a patient woke up. Another more gruesome solution to avoid burying those who were still alive was to perform examinations to test the deadness of the patient. People thought to be dead had their fingers hacked off or endured smoke being literally blown up their butt. The assumption being that if the person didn't wake up, that meant that they were unequivocally dead. Otherwise, the procedure was used to revive those who were on the edge of death via tobacco's supposed restorative properties. There was only one problem with this such test. Catalepsy prevents patients from feeling pain during their catatonic state, so employing extreme measures proved to be an effective method of confirming whether a person was dead or alive. True scary stories of being buried alive also spawned the creation of safety coffins. In the 18th and 19th century Europe, especially Victorian England, enough people were mistakenly buried alive that coffin makers came up with a number of solutions. These caskets were designed with above-ground horns or bells that a person who found themselves mistakenly buried alive could ring from the inside when they woke up trapped underground. Some of these safety coffins even came equipped with a stash of poison in case the person figured out that they wouldn't be saved, which is absolutely horrible. The paranoia around catalepsy was such that different measures were taken to make the population feel safe from that unlikely possibility. The clever ideas meant to prevent premature burial involved rudimentary bells and flags, so the person who had mistakenly been buried would let others know that they were still alive. A lot of people demanded the waiting mortuary method because of an extravagant case like the one about Angelo Hayes that gained fame. He was buried alive after an accident that left him in a deep coma that doctors couldn't differentiate from death. They exhumed his body days after he was buried, and the doctors found that he was alive. After a long struggle, he recovered and became sort of a celebrity. Clearly, people have always been fascinated by death. Safety coffins were designed to prevent premature burial by allowing the person to signal that they had been buried alive by tugging on a cord that would be attached to a bell. There were also other models that had designs for ladders, escape hatches, and feeding tubes. The first recorded safety coffin was ordered by Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick in 1792. This coffin was equipped with keys to open the coffin and the tomb door, along with a window for light and an air tube. In 1829, Johann Taberger designed a bell system that had strings attached to the body, so any movement would alert the night watchman in the cemetery. In 1868, Franz Wester created the burial case, which included a tube for an onlooker to see the face of the corpse. Decomposition can cause movement in the corpse, which could cause a false positive in coffins rigged with bells. With the tube, the watchman of the cemetery could verify that the corpse was still a corpse. Count Michel de Cornice-Cornicki patented a coffin in 1897 and presented it at the Sorbonne. His coffin also detected movement, but would open a tube to supply air along with ringing bells and raising a flag. Despite all the efforts put into making these coffins safe, it is unclear if they actually saved anyone's life. In 1897, doctors, reporters, and diplomats attending a conference at the Sorbonne marveled over a novel contraption presented to them, a coffin designed to alleviate anxieties over premature burial. Taphophobia, fear of being buried alive, was particularly widespread in Victorian-era Europe and the United States, growing as newspapers published horrific accounts of unnecessary internments. People were terrified that doctors were unable to differentiate between death and profound lethargy, comas, or trances, which could strip patients of perceivable signs of life. The new safety coffin, patented the previous year by Count Michel de Carnegie, a chamberlain to Russia's Nicholas II, arrived as a seemingly perfect means to compensate for such potentially lethal misdiagnosis. Known as Le Carnice, the mechanical apparatus equipped any poor soul lying slowly suffocating in a box underground with tools to survive and signal for help, even if still in a trance. On ground level atop the grave sat a spring-loaded iron container, connected to the coffin's interior by an iron tube. From the tube's lower end, a glass ball dangled over the interred's chest, so any slight bodily movement that disturbed it would release the spring. Like a jack-in-the-box, the container would then pop open, welcoming air and light into the coffin. To attract anyone in the cemetery, the box even housed a bell that would chime loudly and a flag attached to its lid that would shoot up to 4 feet tall. Some reports add that the box also had an electric lamp that would burn to provide light after sunset. And if none of those tricks sufficed, anyone buried alive, assuming they were fully awake, could shout for help through the tube. The Count, according to his publicist Horace Velbel, had become so obsessed with preventing premature burial that he had received the Tsar's permission to take leave from his duties as a chamberlain to find a solution. The duties associated with Russian court titles can be unclear, but sources seem to indicate that a chamberlain was a position akin to a chief of staff, and they were often counts. Carnegie had apparently witnessed a young Belgian girl being nearly buried alive, who had been awakened just in time by the thud of earth shoveled onto her coffin. Unable to forget her screams, he shut himself up for 4 years in a castle, tinkering away. Le Carnice, though far from the world's first safety coffin, was an instant hit. The French Society of Hygiene, which organized the conference, unanimously named Carnegie an associate member for his contraption. The esteemed French physiologist Charles Richet, after examining it, exclaimed, "The problem is solved. Lethargy is vanquished." Within a few years, thousands of French citizens had requested in their wills that they be buried in Le Carnice, as William Tebb wrote in his 1905 edition of his book Premature Burial and How It Might Be Prevented. Tebb, who founded the London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial in 1896, also endorsed Le Carnice, noting that with a price tag of only 12 shillings, about 300 today in average UK earnings, its promise of security was exceedingly reasonable. What made the design particularly appealing was its marketability. Easy transportable, the apparatus on the top was designed for reuse, so its cost would remain low, and it would be accessible to people of all financial means. It was ultimately supposed to be a humanitarian invention. Since it involved no complicated machinery, the average cemetery worker would also be able to construct it. The coffin also eliminated the drawbacks of waiting mortuaries, where people had to lay in communal rooms until they were determined to be truly deceased. Since it was also hermetic, La Carne's prevented putrid gases from rising to the living world in the event of actual decomposition. The Count traveled through Europe to showcase La Carne's, as Jan Bondison describes in Buried Alive, the terrifying history of our most primal fear. One demonstration, however, went awry when an assistant, unable to trigger the flag and the bell, he eventually escaped after some anxious digging by Clarnice Clarnicki, but the press was unforgiving, and La Carnese's reputation was forever tainted. Medical experts, too, started expressing reservations. At a meeting at the Academy of Medicine in Paris, the hygienist M. E. Vallon argued that the coffin was too sensitive. Abdominal swelling during putrefaction, often a definitive indicator of death, could set it off. His detailed case for its impracticality led the Academy to forego its proposal that municipalities each buy one for lease to a potential corpse at £1 a day. Undeterred, the Count in 1899 sent his representative, Emile Camus, to New York, where the Parisian presented the coffin to the Medico-Legal Society. He described to his audience a dark world in dire need of such a device, sparing no drama. According to the declarations made by grave diggers of great cities of all countries, when at end of 5 years the dead are removed from the common grave, they find in the coffins convulsed skeletons with the fists clenched and twisted and raised to the jaws. In every part of the world, there is not a community of any importance, town or village, where some memory is not preserved of people being buried alive, and this memory remains like a permanent terror through all time. Emile won over the society. Members praised the coffin's simplicity and economy, and word of it quickly spread. Minneapolis Monthly, the Medical Dial, reported on its success. Doctors in Detroit said they urgently recommended the introduction of that life-saving device. Back in New York, Emile displayed the coffin for a number of years in a showroom at 835 Broadway, New Union Square, and he made it known that his eagerness to test trial it himself to convince any skeptics. A resolute salesman, literally loyal until death to his product, he even was willing to volunteer to undergo repeated burial to prove its purpose. He thinks that in time the Carne's method will be made part of the knowledge of every undertaker who will carry his apparatus in stock. A March 1901 Telephone magazine article noted, "The whole outfit would cost hardly more than $40, and M. Camus thinks there will be no difficulty in putting the article on the market." For all Camus' efforts, though, La Carne's never did take off in America, nor in Europe. Besides unquelled fears that it might fail to function, its reported hypersensitivity introduced strong concerns over false alarms, and unnecessary exhumations of decomposing corpses were nearly as undesirable a vision as being buried alive. In 1915, S.C. Dunbar, who at the time was 30 years old, suffered from an epilepsy attack which everyone thought had killed her. Dr. Briggs of Blackville, South Carolina, who attended Dunbar, had given his professional verdict and declared the woman dead, as he found no signs of life. Professional verdict and declared the woman dead, as he found no signs of life, of breathing and no pulse. Her corpse was placed into a wooden coffin, and their funeral was arranged for 11 the following morning. Back in those times, funerals were done quite quickly, as there was no need for much preparation. Essie's sister lived in the neighboring town, and she was informed late about the funeral as well as her sister's sudden death. The ceremony was quite longer than usual, as not one, but 3 preachers performed, one by one. Sometime later, the coffin was lowered into the 6-foot deep hole and filled with dirt, covering the coffin. Minutes later, Essie's sister had arrived, and she had begged the preachers to dig out the coffin so she can see her sister one last time. After some consideration, the ministers agreed to dig out the coffin. When the coffin lid was opened, everyone was in shock. Essie Dunbar was looking at her sister with a lively smile. Essie was actually alive, and if it weren't for her sister being late, she would have been buried alive. The 3 ministers fell backward into the grave, the shortest suffering 3 broken ribs, as the others who had trampled them in their desperate effort to get out. When the mistake of burying Essie Dunbar alive was discovered, it quickly became a major news story in the small South Carolina town where she lived. Residents were shocked and appalled by this incident and expressed their outrage to local officials. The mayor of the town issued a statement expressing regret for the incident and calling for an investigation into how such a horrific error could have occurred. In response to public outcry, cemetery workers responsible for Essie's mistaken burial were replaced with the new staff who would now be more diligent in their duties. Since that day, everyone in Blackville looked at Essie Dunbar with suspicion, thinking that she's some sort of zombie. The only public account of this is in a newspaper article from 1955, published in the Augusta Chronicle, that mentions Dr. Briggs and how he incorrectly declared one of his patients, Essie Dunbar, dead in 1955. So imagine, if you will, not being able to move a muscle, having a heartbeat, but it's so timid it's not able to be detected. A disease in which you are alive, but mistaken for dead. Imagine waking up in a dark, stuffy, flower-smelling nightmare, a casket buried 6 feet under, or a closed mausoleum. You can't scream or move. Trapped in hell until you are no more. I can't imagine the pure horror, to be so frightened, to die in such a dreadful way. This was the dark truth of many before we were educated. And sadly, if you read enough of these accounts, a pattern begins to emerge, a grammar of early interment. The ripped garments, the skeletons in panicked poses, the scratch marks on the coffin lids, the distant sounds of knocking from new graves. You get the sense that people were exhumed more back then, and that the cemetery offered surprises as often as it did solemnity. Like many buried alive stories, it is difficult to separate truth from fiction, and whether it's all true or just the result of overactive imaginations, these old tombs are worth visiting for their haunting beauty alone. Such features as full-size statues of the statues gazing out at the cemetery while holding the door to the very mausoleums that entrap them.
Hey!